We are now online, and I would like to warmly welcome you to this seminar. And it's my great pleasure to introduce this event, which focuses on lessons learned from a 4-year partnership program between the EIB and the Global Development Network. The presenters today are going to describe our joint program and the lesson that we learn through this program. I'm particularly looking forward to your reaction from the very diverse group of discussants that we managed to put together today. Welcome to you all, and thank you for agreeing to share the reflection and your own experience with us today. To set the scene, I just want to underline the importance of the discussion for us at the EIB on a strategic point of view. If you know the EIB, this is the Bank of the European Union, is an impact investor by definition. We lend to support EU objective to improve lives and create jobs and boost economies, and to address the challenge of climate change. We do this in Europe as well as this is often forgotten, but in fact about 10% of our operations are outside the European Union. In 2020, we stepped up our support. We signed over 9 billion euro of fundings outside the EU, including almost 60 projects in Africa, with around half of our finance going to the private sector. What matters for us is not the volume we commit, but the development results that we achieve. And this is why impact measurement is at the core of the European business and of the work of my team in the economics department. The results measurement information we collect tell us, for example, that the project we financed in 2019 in Africa, the Caribbean and Pacific should contribute to our improving the water supply for 2.76 million people, to supporting over 2,000 small businesses via credit lines to banks, and sustaining 100,000 jobs via microfinance institution, as well as many other positive developments. But we always test way to push our impact further, to gain a deeper insight into one project and to help us demonstrate the power of impact investing to the broader community. Particularly important for a pioneering initiative like our impact finance operations. We needed to learn what works, what lessons we can apply as we keep developing our approach, and also what did not work out as we expected. This is why in 2016 we began this partnership with GDN, where we applied economic research standards to assess real-world investment. This was something very innovative for us, and I think generally quite innovative. And I can already tell you that both EIB and our clients learn a lot out of it. We strongly believe that some aspect of the approach can be scaled across a broader portfolio, and I'm sure that the presenters will be making that argument today. The work has shown us how we can push even further with our impact measurement work, moving beyond accountability to leveraging the knowledge to deliver more impact on the ground, to deliver on the highest standards of development effectiveness wherever we work. So with that so in mind, I would like to hand over to Pierre to open the discussion and enter a little bit more in the description of what we have done and the lessons taken from the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deborah, and it has been a pleasure to enter this innovative initiative with the EIB. And GDN, the Global Development Network, has also learned a lot out of it, and it's my pleasure to try to introduce this discussion by describing the raison d'etre of this program. I would like to do three things. First, I would like to emphasize the need for impact assessment. The second thing I would like to do is to reflect on the meaning and practice of impact assessments. And finally, I would like to introduce our program by arguing that there is a research gap in the practice of impact assessments. And what we try to do together with the EIB is to fill that gap by introducing a new impact assessment product, which was called Deep Dive. And of course, Mani and Matt later on will say much more about Deep Dive that I will. So let me start with the need for impact assessment. In fact, what is striking today is that impact investing is one of the most buoyant segments of financial markets. It has undergone a terrific growth, and it still remains a small part of global finance, but it receives a lot of interest from funders, investors, society at large, as if it was seen, and probably rightly, as a way to reconcile the logic and workings of capitalism with societal, I mean by societal, social and environmental objectives. Let me first recall what impact investing is. It is investment into private companies with the intention to generate socially desirable results in addition to financial returns. Now, estimates of that impact investing vary. In 2020, for example, the OECD puts it at $444 billion US dollars. But the global impact investment network, GEAN, which based its survey on 1,720 impact investors, reaches a higher figure of 715 billion US dollars. So quite substantial, but of course still very small as a percentage of global finance. And this growth of impact investment that we witness is based on two complementary trends. One is in the private sector, where we find investors who are increasingly concerned about societal impact, and that may be for image, it may be for conviction, but this trend is happening and developing. And the second trend is that in the public sector itself, as part of the drive towards the SDGs, the needs for investment into the SDGs and concern about climate change and biodiversity protection, everyone is looking at how to mobilize private sector, not only resources, but also savoir-faire to generate societal impact. So increasingly, development finance institutions fund the private sector, not only because of its financially productive investments, which are, of course, engines of growth, but also to generate societal impact. And certainly what the EIB is doing, and notably under the impact financing envelope, which was granted to the EIB as part of the Cotonou Agreement, and which provided the projects that were assessed during this joint project, is a case in point. So this growth rests on our capacity to assess impact. There cannot be any sustainable expansion of this impact investing market without credible, sound impact assessments. And there are three rationales behind this need for impact assessment. One is accountability. Impact investment investees and funds must demonstrate impact results to the funders. The second is learning. To achieve social objectives, societal objectives, including the SDGs, we need to understand impact. We need to know how to measure impact in a credible way. That is a crucial part. And this is a way to learn how to generate that impact more effectively. The third rationale is communication. And it's a very noble one. To attract resources, impact investors need to demonstrate that they know how to generate impact efficiently and effectively. So it's a little bit different from accountability, but it's also very important to sustain the momentum and the dynamics. Now, what is impact? Well, the general meaning is that it is any change resulting from an action. Well, when let's say to have an impact on something. But for impact investing, it's a little bit different because the intention has to be to generate a positive societal impact. And then the question is, what does positive mean? Whether we are talking about a single effect is positive or not, that implies a value judgment. And then we have the problem of aggregation between various effects. Any action will have several kinds of impact on several aspects of life. Some will be positive, some will be negative. For example, raising the carbon tax may implicitly tax poorer people because they refer more to energy sources that produce CO2. So there are always a number of effects, some being positive according to some value judgment, some other being negative. But then how do we aggregate all these effects into a measure of impact? The impact is a result of an action activity that uses input to produce outputs and outcomes, the latter leading to impacts, but these impacts are multifarious. They consider many aspects of our life, and having a synthetic judgment about impact is, of course, very difficult, which means that probably when we assess impact, it's useful to stick to very specific impact measurements and to leave aggregation to debate, because there is no scientific way to aggregate. And on top of that, societal values are shifting over time. They're unstable over time. Let me comment a little bit on the chain of impact generation. There is a whole chain of stakeholders, funders, intermediaries, investees, and all of this also interact with knowledge brokers who monitor, measure, and guide impact generation. So there are various origins of impact. There is investment impact from the funder and intermediary, the choices that the EIB, for example, makes when it considers investing, and that has an impact. We have the enterprise impact, which is the impact of the investee, which produces goods and services and has a broader impact on society. And there are some aspects of the impact that are non-monetary and that are tightly related with learning, with communication, and with a non-monetary way to learn about how to generate better impact. So impact studies, due to this diversity of stakeholders, mean different things to different stakeholders. A major aspect of what is needed to provide sound impact measurement is to check intention and documenting whether that intention led to impact. And that requires studying causality and attribution. Without a careful analysis of causality and attribution, one cannot know what generates impact and how it is generated. So clearly the kind of impact assessments that are needed to support and sustain the expansion of the impact investing market are those that discuss causality and attribution in a sound and credible way. And that goes, of course, beyond measuring outputs and beyond ex ante and ex post comparisons. There are several methods to discuss causality. First, one should start with the theory of change, preferably anchored in theory, because that is the systematic approach through which one can anticipate the generation of impact. Then we need an analysis of the counterfactual. What would have happened without the intervention? It's hard to discuss impact without asking that questions. And then we need to compare a control group with a treatment group and take out biases. And there are many ways to do that. One can resort to natural experiments when it's feasible. One can use several experimental and quasi-experimental methods. There is no, and the point is that there is no real gold standard there. There has been a talk in the literature that the randomized controlled trials, RCT, could be claimed as gold standard, but they provide unbiased estimators, but not always the most relevant or meaningful ones. And on top of that, the results from an RCT are not necessarily easily generalized to other situations, other countries, other environments. So there is no real gold standard. There is a toolbox of methods that is available, no optimal method, and the proper method to choose depends on the case under study, the availability of data, the possibility of randomization, but also the resources and the capacity of those undertaking that impact measurement. When we look at the current impact assessments, what we find is a very diverse, heterogeneous field in terms of nature of the studies, of quality of objectives. In practice, impact investors use a wide variety of approaches, have tried to improve clarity and credibility by adopting common standards and frameworks, and increasingly manage for impact, that is, include the intention of impact at all the stages of project implementation, monitoring, and execution. But the main point is that academic investigation of causality is time, capacity, and resource consuming, and this is not attractive for private investors. Hence, we observe a research gap. And the EIB-GDN deep dives are a specific kind of impact studies that make the recourse to research-based approaches more palatable for all stakeholders. They marry methodological rigor with the time-bound needs of impact investing stakeholders, and especially the needs of the investees who produce goods and services that generate impact. So let me conclude and then give the floor to Mani. There is a multifarious field of impact assessments. There is a gap between the private values of impact studies, which mainly rest on accountability, communication, and targeted business learning, and their social value, which rest on measuring impact, investigating causality, and investigating how impact is generated. Bridging that gap requires analytical efforts as well as external incentives and resources. And the point of this joint initiative with the EIB is to show that rigorous academic research has a larger role to play at all stages of the investment process. We call for an increasing cooperation with academia for impact assessment. That has a cost, and that cost is unlikely to be covered by private impact investors. It's as always, there is a public good aspect to it, and we cannot expect the private markets to spontaneously generate that effort. And then to support the market for impact investing, that effort is needed to promote research-based evaluations that insist on rigor, control of biases, while considering private stakeholders' interests and motivations. There is room for an innovative public-private partnership there, in which public funders would support this academic effort. And this is exactly what the EIB has done in that project. So again, Deborah, thanks a lot for this opportunity to work with you and to produce this new kind of assessments called deep dives. And I'm happy now to give the floor to Mani.
Thank you very much, Pierre. And thanks again, Deborah and EIB, as well as Pierre and GDN, for giving me the opportunity to be involved in this project. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope that everyone can see that. Pierre, is that visible to everybody?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. My job in this panel is to tell you exactly what the EIB-GDN program deep dive tried to do. Pierre's already motivated very well the need and the definition of deep dives. And what I'm going to do is to present to you a summary, which is chapter 3 in a book that we're trying to write for about this, on what exactly happened in this particular program. This is the work produced by many authors, including Pierre, of course, at GDN, Nina Fenton and Claudia Kali at EIB, as well as the external advisors to the project, Sharok Ferdost, Aleko Saris, François Bourguignon, Ariane Legovini. I've been asked simply to present our joint work, but they promised that they would answer all the difficult questions that came out at the end in exchange. So I hope they do that. Okay. Now I'm trying to. I cannot. I'm having trouble moving the presentation around. Okay. All right. Pierre already summarized well that the impact assessment, we're trying to do several objectives, answer relevant questions to EIB and other stakeholders, be rigorous in methods, and to contribute to a new way of thinking about impact measurement that really, as he mentioned, it marries the needs of academic research and investor interest. It was also meant to build research capacity in among those who were undertaking the work, which are mostly people from what EIB calls the ACP countries, the African and Caribbean and Pacific countries. This was a challenge because what we're trying to do is with one instrument, we're trying to meet multiple objectives. And as economists, we know that that's breaking one of our principal rules called the Tinbergen rule, which says that to successfully achieve the independent policy targets, at least the same number of independent policy instruments are required. Nevertheless, hope springs eternal, and we went ahead and tried to do exactly what Jan Tinbergen told us not to do, which is to have one instrument that meets all these different objectives. So in the time I have left, what I'm going to try to do is to outline what the main components were of the deep dive, the DD program, how it was implemented, what was produced, and what were the lessons learned. Pierre already outlined who the main stakeholders were. Of course, EIB is crucial, and their impact investing activities, which is to invest in financial intermediary companies, who then in turn invest in service enterprises, many of which are small and medium enterprises, SMEs, to stimulate private sector development in a country, but ultimately cause economic growth that will reduce poverty and also lead to positive environmental outcomes. GDN's role was to lead the recruitment of research fellows, what we call, what I'll refer to now, RFs, who will address research topics and typically whether or not these investments were doing what they were supposed to do and accomplish their objectives. External advisors were also hired, and there were 5 of us to support research fellows to help EIB and GDN support the research fellows. So the key aspect of this is the recruitment of the research fellows. It was chosen by a joint team by all the stakeholders, and they must meet academic standards, but they must also be from the ACP countries. There were about over 450 applicants, 30 were chosen, so it was very selective, and they mostly worked in pairs except for one, leading to 16 deep dives. Let me just mention a couple of things. One is that most of these were from sub-Saharan Africa. I think we wanted to get more, a couple of more from the Caribbean and Pacific countries, but it was more difficult to recruit from those regions. We were quite pleased that the representation of women is not quite 50%, quite a bit less, but in relation to the proportion of economists and quantitative analysts in the field, we thought that this was respectable. And then most were not just from sub-Saharan Africa, but they were actually still living and working in sub-Saharan Africa, which again was a positive element. These RFs were supported by a research budget as well as the work of the external advisors, and crucially further support given by EIB's research department and the GDN staff. So one takeaway lesson from this is there is talent to undertake DDs in ACP countries, especially technical talent in terms of quantitative analysis. We were quite pleased that we were able to recruit these people. The talent is relatively inexperienced, not just in research, but more importantly, perhaps for this exercise, in practical issues, especially dealing with operational clients. And we could discuss that a little bit more in the discussion later on what the challenges were for this. Research to the RFs was key. Entry briefings and training were helpful, but also that the reviews at each state of implementation, if you like, the hand-holding that was done by the EAs, EIB, and GDN. Let me now go through quickly what we learned about implementing the DDs in terms of project selection, definition of research and evaluation questions, developing the plan, data collection and analysis, and the review and dissemination of the work. And I'll go very quickly through each of these lessons. The EIB was crucial in played a crucial role in interacting with their operational staff in choosing the financial intermediary companies and the firms then receiving the financial loans to identify projects that were going to be the subject of the DDs, and then also to introduce the research fellows to them. At one point, we discussed whether or not we should focus on specific sectors to be strategic, but in the end, as there were so few DDs, there were only going to be 16, and that there were not that many opportunities of firms who were willing to participate, and the difficulty in working with them. The final choice of project is more opportunistic than strategic. Still, this graph shows you that there was a good mix. There were many, of course, in the finance and services area, including microfinance. But there were also several in IT and communications, and energy and trade. The countries spanned a number of ACP countries, mostly in Africa. 12 of the DDs were there, and 2 DDs were in the Caribbean, and 2 DDs were in multiple African countries. Having identified the projects to be studied, then the next step was to develop the research and evaluation questions that will try to meet these dual objectives of being helpful to EIB and its clients with the financial intermediary companies and the ultimate investees, but also the research capacity building objective of the exercise. It needed several interactions because, as Pierre mentioned, they must not only be relevant, they must be evaluable given the limited time and budget. Each of these DDs had to be done within 1 calendar year. And in fact, by the time the research projects were chosen, researchers typically only had about 8 months to actually undertake the work. And they have to be academically rigorous in terms of meeting the attribution standard that Pierre mentioned. So the DDs were not evaluations of entire programs, but typically of some sub-programs of projects. And there was an attempt to focus on environmental and social goals. An example of this is that the evaluation of an investment in a dam in Africa, the Nachtigal Dam, was not an attempt to evaluate whether or not the dam was meeting environmental as well as energy objectives, but the project was limited to an analysis of whether or not one component, which is to provide training to communities which were going to be affected by the dam, was actually having an effect as a way to narrow down the question. After the research questions were done, the next step was, of course, to agree on a research approach. And Pierre already alluded to this, and there were 2 key challenges that we felt that the DDs had to really contend with. One was to formulate this theory of change in which the link between what was being invested in, the inputs, and the outcomes and the assumptions of the logic chain that led from inputs to activities to outputs to outcomes was clear, because this was going to be key to identify the assumptions that would be the subject of the research questions to make sure that in fact what was invested in led to those outcomes. I think what the researchers found that, of course, in each of these investee firms, they did have a theory of change of how their loans were going to lead to social outcomes, but it was not always written down. And the researchers had to actually then try to redo the theory of change, which was a challenge. The other challenge was choosing an appropriate methodology. As Pierre mentioned, rigor was desired, but data, time, and resources were constrained. In fact, RCT, the randomized control trial, was feasible for only one deep dive. Most of the rest used quasi-experimental methods, including difference in differences, propensity score matching, and instrumental variables. Sometimes an evaluation wasn't even possible. For example, in one research project, which were trying to provide the social value of providing the platform for paying utility bills by mobile money rather than by going to a bank or financial entity. The project didn't estimate whether or not the implementation of this platform led to outcomes, but instead it focused on willingness to pay using contingent valuation methods of how do the beneficiaries value such a payment platform. Simply because when the research was done, implementation had not started yet, so the timing was an issue. After the research questions were done, the next step was in fact to collect data and do the analysis. I think that for a project like this, given the time element, there was an expectation that the researchers could in fact use a lot of already existing administrative data to conduct their work. That was more difficult. There was administrative data on financial outcomes, but there was no data typically on the environmental and social outcomes. So in fact, the researchers had to conduct primary data collection in that very short time period that was done. So in a way, I'm very impressed that they were able to do as much work as they did, given that I have been involved in a research project that took years simply because surveys took years and the researchers did a good job in doing as much as they could with the time and resources at hand. Once the data was collected, the researchers then, of course, had to draft the main report, which was the main product of the DD, and the external advisors at EIB then had to review it. This took several iterations. I think that we found that the researchers were quite competent in dealing with technical issues, but a key issue, especially because when you're dealing with relatively inexperienced researchers, was drawing appropriate policy program and implementation conclusions based on limited evidence. There's a great temptation to overreach on claims, perhaps could be more than the evidence found, and the researchers found it difficult to generalize beyond the specific context. This was something that was worked with, and I think that in the end it all worked out. But living within these constraints was a real issue. And finally, just a simple presentation and writing were key challenges because what I think we all learned is that regardless of how well the technical work was done, that in order to reach out to the clients, that presentation and writing had to be clear and actually had to be targeted to those who were not so technically trained. And I think Matt will probably talk more about this. Finally, as I mentioned, there were objectives that went well beyond the work of the DDs, which was building research capacity. And in the end, I think that the research fellows themselves felt more confident that in their skills, they gained experience and confidence using the methodology, but they also learned about new methods of analysis, especially when they found out that they couldn't actually do randomized control trials or other things that they wanted to do. Soft skills and communications, I think we all felt were built very substantially. They were more confident and at ease in their relationships with colleagues and stakeholders, including private sector companies and firms, which at the beginning was quite difficult. And also that I think that they learned that building a research project from beginning to end, rather than with data already there, which they actually had to collect data as well as to form research questions that were relevant to the clients, was something that they had to undertake for the first time. So in sum, here are some summary takeaways in this chapter. One is that deep dive research needs to take into account the general lack of existing data, and you have to make sure that there was room to actually collect data from primary data. Engagement with the company implementing the investment was key. These are the firms who are actually being the subject of the research, who are being evaluated, and that they had to be involved because this was a learning exercise, not for accountability. That engagement was really quite important. Researchers had to be flexible, as I already mentioned, on the approach and methodology to apply. I won't go more into that. We can go more into that in the discussions. Conclusions need to be tailored to the limitations of the analysis. That it's very important to make sure that the policy conclusions don't overreach what the data are telling us. Getting the report the right presentational form is crucial. Research capacity can be built, but it's a slow process. And finally, while the cost of the DD were not as significant, aside from the 25,000 euros that each of the DD research fellows were given, there was, of course, a substantial time of EIB staff, GDN, as well as the EAs that were involved. They're not prohibitive. They were relatively small in comparison, and judge if the reactions of all the stakeholders were outweighed by the benefits. And finally, in terms of outcomes on the research side, I know that Matt will talk about outcomes on the use side. As far as outcomes on the research side, I think for many of the DDs, in fact, we felt as external advisors did pass the academic muster. In fact, we're hoping that even just from the first two calls of the DDs, the first 20, that at least 6 or 7 of them can be published in a peer-reviewed academic journal for a special issue. So with that, let me turn it over to Matt, who I guess will walk you through more about the takeaways on the use of the DD side. So Matt, let me stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thanks, Manny. And hi, everyone. So my name is Matt Ripley. I'm head of impact at The Good Economy. We're a social advisory firm specializing in impact measurement and management. And as Manny said, I'm going to speak to kind of whether and to what extent knowledge resulting from the deep dives was actually used. A lot of what I'm going to say is based on a chapter I wrote and research I undertook for this forthcoming deep dive handbook that Manny also mentioned. And that chapter really focuses on use from the perspective of the EIB and private sector partners. So those companies who are subject to deep dive research and the investment funds that were providing those companies with capital. For the sake of time today, I'm going to mainly talk about and give you a few highlights from the private sector perspective, particularly on the challenges and opportunities of applying academic research standards and techniques to assess real world investments. So the starting point really is to kind of recognize that as everyone's mentioned so far, while deep dives weren't formal evaluation exercises per se, they did fulfill a somewhat evaluative function in the industry, in that they address questions of the effectiveness of impact of aspects of given investments. So one way we've approached understanding deep dive use is to look at and adapt frameworks for understanding evaluation use. There's obviously a lot of literature on this over the years, but basically boils down to examining the the extent of actions taken or thoughts crystallize as a result of the evaluation, or in our case, the deep dives. And just to note here that use can come about both from the results and findings of the study, so what came out of the study, but as well as the kind of process learning from actually taking part in the study itself. There's lots of different ways in which deep dive information can be used and was used in practice throughout the 15 or so deep dive studies that took place over the last few years of the EIB-GDN program. I'm going to highlight a few here, 3 of them most relevant to the business and fund manager context, really is the launch pad for some discussions. So the first and probably biggest category of use from the private sector perspective was technically called instrumental use. So that's really making use of deep dive findings for programming. And this covers programming in a really broad sense. So making decisions about individual projects or company activities, as well as using data and results for things like reporting, marketing, and fundraising. So it's a kind of very tangible cause and effect between the deep dive and use. Many companies, in fact, the majority of companies in which a deep dive was undertaken, this was really the first structured data collection they'd undertaken on impact. And in the main, what we found was that companies were using findings that were related more just to the output level of a theory of change, so related to things that were quite within their sphere of influence, taking up and using findings related to customer demographics, who they were reaching, or product feedback, what people thought of their products and services. A lot of companies mentioned this data actually helped not necessarily make new decisions, but finalize decisions that they were had already made or already had top of mind, things like price points, so what price, the cost of the service, or marketing strategies, kind of which product features to emphasize. A smaller number of companies, not many, mention using the deep dives to inform more high-level strategic decisions, strategic thinking about future business strategy, things like the type of business model and which target markets or geographies to reach. And quite a few of the deep dive findings in this instrumental category were actually profiled on things like company websites and annual reports, and lots of fund managers used them in investor presentations. As you can imagine, this was much more likely to take place where the findings were broadly positive. I think one of the interesting things to note is that deep dives seem to uncover relatively little new knowledge for companies. As I mentioned, actually what it was doing was reinforcing what they already knew, perhaps intuitively, but had lacked supporting evidence to demonstrate. So they found the findings at the company level largely in line with what they were expecting. In the words of one company, the deep dive backed up and quantified what we knew already, but nonetheless played a really important had a really important kind of role in helping these companies move from more intuition to evidence-backed or evidence-based decision-making. Fewer companies made use of the outcome kind of level findings, or particularly those related to causal impacts and attribution. And when they did, it was much more at what you could call a systems level. So 2 companies actually reported using the findings of the deep dive to engage with legislators and policymakers as a way to cement their social license to operate. And for these companies, this is a point I'll come back to a bit later, the value of the deep dive approach is really when it was geared towards this, not to a company audience, but to an external audience of policymakers and the public to actually influence public policy. So the second category of use is conceptual use. That's kind of about enhancing more generalized knowledge about the type of intervention, not the specific intervention, but the family of interventions. Here, because businesses are generally a little bit more focused on the success of their own product or service, they're a little less interested in such generalizable public good learning. The exception there was where companies did have a very innovative product or service, things like solar-powered micro-utilities, where the kind of the global evidence base underpinning their own theory of change and their product was still quite thin or still quite early stage. So here companies were recognizing what they needed really was that they're kind of building out the evidence base to essentially underpin their social impact thesis. The third and final category is on capacity building use. So in the chapter, we take quite a big look at this from the EIB side. From a private sector perspective, this is really about did the deep dives contribute to kind of strengthening a culture of impact measurement, leaving behind any capacities at the company level, either from a content or process knowledge perspective. here a little bit less use from the private sector perspective, partly because, as Manny has already mentioned, the kind of capacity building aspects of the program were a little bit more or much more geared towards capacity building at the researcher level, at the EIB level, rather than leaving things behind in companies or fund managers. But it's also because there was kind of relatively little appetite, what we heard from private sector partners, to embed more of the academic research techniques into their ongoing operations, mainly because they lacked incentives, in the words of one founder, to, as they called it, invest in academic rigor. That's not to say that companies didn't make use of the deep dives. They did, especially, as I said, on the kind of that first category, instrumental use, but they had relatively low interest in developing their own internal capacities to collect data beyond limited topics, such as kind of user and feedback data, which by themselves don't require this academic approach. And this is a point I'll come back to later. So based on those kind of more factual experiences of how the deep dives were actually used, we were able to identify a number of factors that were actually influencing deep dive use across the different stakeholders. And here I'm going to highlight two in particular from the private sector perspective. The first is that use is very much shaped by the ways in which impact is generated through the business model. So much like impact investments more widely, as Pierre was mentioning, EIB investments flow into businesses that create impact in very different ways. Some companies might be more mission driven, with a kind of explicit social purpose, like a social enterprise. Other companies might be more mainstream commercial operations, but nonetheless expect to create social impact because of the nature of the products and services they sell. And the appetite to kind of use impact data and to actually take on board and use the findings of deep dives to influence business operations and strategy really varies depending on, again, in the words of one company we spoke to, kind of how much social impact is tied to the commercial engine. Mission-driven enterprises will likely see impact as kind of much more aligned with their commercial engine, while in others, in the words of another company subject to deep dive research, we're pretty much a for-profit company and we tack a little bit of impact on the side. So for the former category, deep dive information may be kind of a real need to know, or the latter, it's going to be a bit more of a nice to know information, unless there is a strong intersection between the kind of the impact data and data that can be really commercialized for business value purposes. So I think a key lesson here is that each company's use case needs to be understood in context. So in other words, their incentives for getting a better understanding of impact and for actually using deep dive data, particularly around causality, are likely to be extremely different. The second factor influencing deep dive use was that we found that deep dive use can be maximized if it's aligned to the business life cycle. So what does this mean? Well, companies subject to the deep dive research, again, kind of span the business life cycle from very early stage companies and kind of more at the startup end of the spectrum, still refining their business offer, to more growth stage companies that were actually seeking to scale up their product or service. And obviously the type of products and service varied extremely, from those with quite a long history, or certainly a sector with a long history like microfinance, to others that were developing much more innovative products where they were almost building out a market, a sector, and were real pioneers. So again, this kind of different company context shaped the demand for different types of impact data, and ultimately shaped how useful these companies actually found the deep dive. There's a distinction there that we kind of saw emerging between companies who really emphasized the need for, we call the need for speed, and those who really wanted to prioritize the importance of rigor. And we've kind of split these in the handbook and in the research we've done into two groups. We call it the kind of the academic camp and the actionable camp. So just to really briefly outline what those are. The academic camp, here kind of companies wanted to use deep dive information for kind of, I guess, more systems or high level purposes, like maybe marketing or fundraising to external policymakers, again, to an external audience. So these companies have often built their whole business model around anecdotal or secondary data or assumptions or intuition, or kind of taking research done by other companies or in other countries and other sectors, for instance, on the value of using mobile money wallets, but they don't have empirical data yet, for that company or in the company's country of operation. So for these companies, really what they wanted actually was, the highest level of rigor possible in the study. The deep dive in one company's words, had to be really good to have potential for fundraising. So there was a kind of a clear value add in the approach taken to the deep dives, as the most rigorous methods in another company's words were something that they would not be able to justify spending time and budget doing themselves. And here the independent nature of the study was important, especially when used to validate aspects of the business model for an external audience. On the other side, the actionable camp were more kind of venture-backed companies that were probably selling more innovative products and services, are much less likely to have fixed business models. In the jargon of the kind of startup world, these were kind of businesses that were very agile and pivoting, in other words, changing their strategy and even the products that they sell quite often. And as another company noted, kind of when reflecting on the kind of the different methods available for measuring impact, they thought that academic models that often assume a fixed treatment were not so useful. So these companies have, lots of different types of data needs, but often tend to value that fast feedback data in order to make rapid decisions about customer segmentation, satisfaction, willingness to pay, over the more kind of outcome and attribution data, because they see their theory of change as essentially a work in progress and more fluid. So of course, while they wanted data to have, rigor and a degree of rigor in the sense of being very thorough and thoughtfully and carefully collected, the entrepreneurs and decision makers at the helm of these companies really prioritize the speed of data. As one company said to us, quicker and faster is better than deep academic rigor. So for them, deep dives didn't have to be perfect, but they really had to be timely. And that's because startups move so quickly. There's obviously a danger that if the findings and results are not timely, the insights arrive too late to make any decisions, again, from a purely private sector perspective. So just to wrap up, I think the core challenge is nicely explained by one EIB member of staff we spoke to for research on this chapter. The core challenge for deep dives was that how to adjust that level of rigor to show really useful results depending on the audience. Striking that and finding that right balance, as kind of Manny mentioned, it's not been easy, but it's something the deep dive set out to do, especially when there's competing priorities. And what was clear from the company perspective was that kind of placing a very strong focus on methods and seeking to apply the highest standards of academic rigor risks obviously wielding kind of almost a sledgehammer to crack a nut if the user needs are for simpler, more actionable insights. But on the other hand, impact studies, if they're going to be a very utilitarian view and prioritizing just company use, risks turning the whole deep dive approach into pure market research. And actually, as one fund manager we spoke to felt, this would actually bring into question the whole additionality and value for money of the deep dive approach, because essentially for all data points aside from kind of outcome and attribution, in their words, companies can make decisions themselves. If they need data on product feedback, if they need data on customer demographics, they can hire in a local provider much more quickly. So that's really some of the kind of the key trade-offs, the key tensions, and I think what we found from the research that there was a significant degree of deep dive use, particularly from the private sector perspective. It was obviously mixed in terms of how much those findings were internalized and acted on. But again, this was partly because actually the use potential of the private sector partners was not always front and center of the design of the programs. It was one of the competing stakeholder priorities. So actually, in that sense, it was a very positive sign that we did uncover so much evidence of use and value from the private sector perspective. And I'll just leave you with, again, the trade-offs. Was very interesting to see that, again, from the multiple stakeholders, the study that was actually, I think, most valued by EIB stakeholders was probably the one that was least valued from the company perspective. So there is an interesting question around how you actually meet those needs of different user groups, that everyone may derive some type of use, but it might not be that everyone's deriving exactly the same and equal type of use.
Thank you very much. And I think we heard a lot about the different expertise from those directly involved in the major stakeholders in the projects. But what I would like to do now is to have more of a discussions, and I am extremely happy to have with us three discussants that can really bring something to the table. On the one side is Frenny Letier, Senior Partner CEO of Southbridge Investments. Then Esther Lee Ashandi, that is actually one of the fellow of the EIB-GDN program and postdoctoral fellow at the University of Dar es Salaam. And then Franco Consano, Deputy Head of the Evaluation and Results at the European Commission. And I think Franco is a very important person also in the panel. The other two will bring the more operational expertise, but Franco will also bring the expertise of one of the key stakeholders that has the challenge of proving this kind of impact. It's a very similar challenge to the one that we have at the EIB on proving that the resources are used in the most effective ways. I would like to start this discussion asking Frenny to start with a couple of considerations, thinking about you have not been directly involved in the projects, but you have heard about what we have been doing with this project, what we aim at, and what we achieved. So it would be interesting for you to give an assessment and also bring other examples that you have seen in your activities of similar kind of programs. Frenny, the floor is yours. We have 30 minutes to go, and we would like to also have questions from the floor. So I would ask Frenny if you can start your first intervention with a 5 minutes points of discussion.
Thank you very much, Deborah. It's a pleasure to be connected and to have a chance to read the results of this excellent work that has been done between GDN and EIB. I will make remarks on 3 themes. The first one is the data side, because the quality of data was one of the issues that was raised. The second is using evaluation results to design impact investment programs, because that's the direct opportunity to learn from what has already been assessed. And then the third one is the role of technology to link up investee companies, investors, and researchers in a way that adds value to all 3. Because I listened to the comments made by Mani and also by Matt on how the researchers viewed and got access to the data to do their work, but also who was using the results and bragging about them or not, depending on what was found in the evaluation. So those are the 3 themes I will cover. So starting with the first theme of data, I think one of the results that I really liked in the evaluated report showed that even in instances where data is poor or has to be collected as you go, there are methodologies that allow researchers to actually form conclusions that are of relevance to the investee companies and to the investors. And so the question then is, how do those methodologies get popularized such that the companies and the investors are able to actually rely on them for evaluation? And I think here's an opportunity. It's a subject that I have been has been very close to my heart, is linking the private sector to universities and to the research world, because this is clearly a gap in the market where this opportunity can be brought to bear. Now, what is happening in that space? I'll give a quick example of something that we are doing with the IFC and World Economic Forum, and I think the researchers in the GDN network would probably be very valuable once this data is collected. We are creating an end-to-end secure blockchain platform for investing, but at the same time, because we are creating a digital footprint for the companies, we are asking them to insert data in a dynamic way on number of jobs created. This is targeted to women-owned, women-led, and women-sourced SMEs. And the economic research shows that SMEs actually are the best mechanism for job creation in the market, but they also are the first impacted with any shocks, and therefore jobs are lost. So if you're measuring impact in terms of job creation, you have to embed those dynamics into the analysis. And it's not in the interest of the private sector to actually do that, but it is definitely in the interest of governments and the public sector to know where are jobs being created and where, particularly with the results of COVID, where you should send resources to support either job protection or job creation. So that creates a very nice opportunity for the results of this study to be taken to the next level using these dynamic data collection techniques that can then generate the research data flow that researchers could use to come up with answers that satisfy the different stakeholders, whether it's the investee companies, the investors, and the public sector. The second area is how does evaluated results and evidence, as in the case of this joint work between GDN and EIB, makes its way to investors' design and structuring of how they intervene then with the investee companies. And here I think there are three very important elements. First, the easier the results are to interpret, the easier they are absorbed, because then it's quite straightforward to say, okay, I'm going to have this component in my design where I embed, for example, an accelerator for capacity building that would then influence the potential success and growth trajectory of a company, because I've seen the evaluated results show me that this can be done. So ease of interpretation and use is a key feature. And I think that's one of the strengths of this work done by GDN and EIB. It's that when you read through the report, whether you're an academic or not, whether you are an economist or not, or in finance or not, you understand the result. So that's number one. The second key feature is the modularization of results. The more the results can be embedded in modular form, the better it is. And I think there's a complexity here because some of the features are interrelated, and that becomes then difficult. And it's something maybe research can still go and take a look at and see how that can be dealt with. And then the third, which is a very important feature as well, is the extent to which the findings are transportable or replicable with different settings, and therefore the importance of the controls and how those controls are described, because then other investors in other locations can take those results and embed them in their own designs. So for the last bit, which is now the question that I thought I would maybe close with, is once you have now these elements of data in place, including the dynamism of technology, and you found a way to share results in a way that they're easy to interpret, can be modularizable, and that the control factors are in such a way that the conclusions are transportable to other locations. A big remaining factor becomes how you then embed this in a long-term alignment of incentives between the different stakeholders. For investors, the good news is that more and more opportunities to balance impact and profitability are being recognized by the market. So the trend of the research is moving in the right direction, that there will be more resources available to support results reporting and therefore to support research and data collection. The second, however, and this is where the challenge is, a number of entities, including some of which I sit on their boards or even in our own investing work, see this as a cost because of the cost of data collection, the cost of follow-up, the size of the ESG teams, and it becomes difficult to justify. And therefore it comes to with three effects: either results washing, which is one area, extending the credibility of results and claiming more than what is actually shown, or actually narrowing down and picking fewer areas to track because of the cost, and therefore limiting perhaps the broader knowledge about what could be found. And I think here maybe the finding in the reports that EIB found some of the results more relevant than the investee companies or the private companies concerned, gives an opportunity that maybe there's a public goods element that could take up that slack, and how to think about designing that. And then finally, just in closing, one of the things that we have found very useful, and that's why we've decided to work with the IFC and the World Economic Forum, and I think the data we generate will be very useful for research and potentially a partnership with GDN in the long run, is that when you find a coalition that then works, because we have to generate returns for our investors, IFC has returns plus impact, and the World Economic Forum can focus purely on the public goods. So we found an alliance that actually works. And I think this is what I found the most relevant in this report, the fact that EIB and GDN in partnership found the best way to match public interest with private value. Thank you.
Franny, thank you very much. I think you made a very important point, and I particularly share with you the fact of having a very clear message out of the studies, because we are trying with this program to target different readers and different users of the outcome, and having a very clear, well-defined link that proves the impact of the project. Is something presenting it in a very simple and very clear way is something that I think is fundamental for achieving the various objectives that we are putting together in this program. I would like to move to Esther Lea Achandi, and I think Esther, you can give us a very insightful experience of what you have seen in the program and what you learn and what were the challenge for you in the program.
Yes.
Let us have our view, your view.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deborah, and good to see you all. I'm Esther Lea Achandi, a postdoctoral fellow at the International Livestock Research Institute. And I've been on this program as a researcher, and I'll just give about I'll focus on 3 key areas. My experience with regard to working in pairs, because as researchers, we were paired up, so we were not working on the projects by ourselves. So we worked in pairs in the assessment. So the first thing is my experience in the pairing process, my experience in the capacity building dimension of the project, and then also my experience in working on an ongoing project in the private sector. And beginning with my experience working in pairs, I felt that it's one of those things that was very, very important, because as a researcher, you have different things that are pulling at your time. And then when you're working together, there's a form of ability, pushing each other and encouraging each other to go on, so that nothing is left out or nothing gets left undone, or you don't have a lapse of a whole period of time when you've not worked on this thing. Because in research, the more you work on something, the more you build momentum to keep going. If you put it on hold, it's as though you have to repeat whatever earlier process you had done before. So for me, it was a very, very important thing that, we were working together in pairs. The other thing is to work in pairs where your capacity is not as strong as the other person, you're able to learn from them, but then also the other person learns from you. So we got to split up the research in several parts, divide up the tasks, and really just flow almost seamlessly, because you see that everyone complements the other in the way that they worked. And for 2020, the window within which I was, it came with COVID and everything else. So for me, it was a very challenging time. And personally, I remember I lost a baby. So if it were not for my research partner, it would have put the whole project on a very different dimension. But then because we were working together somehow, the season when you don't feel like touching anything, you're there, he's able to push on and move on. And we were able to continue and finish the program. The other thing is now the second dimension of capacity building. We were paired up with expert advisors who were very, very, very helpful. Helpful in the sense that with someone who is more experienced in the field, nothing gets to fall through the cracks. So in the process of interacting with the farms, in the process of developing the proposal, in the process of interacting with EIB and just sharing out whatever when we're writing the write-ups, they always have that eye that will see what yourself as a researcher who's not been in the field for so long may have missed out. So that aspect of enabling us to learn a lot, but also helping us in the sense that the quality of work gets to improve exponentially, I would say, because they're able to catch those things that could have slipped your mind. It has been very, very helpful. And also the networking opportunity, because the expert advisors do come with a whole lot of networks that they're already plugged into. It was also an opportunity to plug into a totally huge different network, to the extent that my expert advisor, we ended up on another international conference where I was moderating the session and he was a keynote speaker. So it was very, very helpful and very nice also. The other thing now that I'll talk about is the third part, which is working on an ongoing project in the private sector. The fact that it's ongoing and you're talking about impact, it means even the language of presenting the results, I cannot say that, you know, this project has totally changed lives in this dimension. I have to use a language that leaves an allowance for time to change or things to change over time. So it's one of those things that as a researcher came out very strongly, because usually we research on something, it's a project, you wound up the project, you say, this is the evaluation, this was the outcome, but this is ongoing. So in the language, we had to be very, very careful that, okay, as we talk about this impact, could it change over time? Could it become a negative impact over time? Could there be other impacts that rise up over time, which was also very, very important. An ongoing project also, it meant that you're interacting with people, you're interacting with the management teams also change, because people, you don't say, ceteris paribus, this is who we have met, we'll deal with them to the end. No, data collection phase, you're working with this person. Over time, they get very busy, you need to you get to be handed over to someone else. So there's that relationship building experience that also comes in, you become more versatile. And then generally as a researcher, we usually focus on, I'll produce my research, have my policy brief, hand it on to policymakers. Here we were not looking at policymakers anymore. We were looking at the people that were going to consume our research as primarily were these farms. And then how do we keep them on board as we keep engaging with them? It's no longer I'll get a policy brief and hand it over to you. They were part of the knowledge generation process, which was very, very, very helpful. And in conclusion, because of time, I'll just highlight a few takeaways, like what I thought were very, very key for me. The assessment, we assessed ongoing projects. So my thought was that it would also be helpful for these same projects if there could be another assessment at another time. If this is if this company is a going concern and then over time it's still available, somebody else could take up that these were the results at point T. Now at this new point, over time, what has happened to that result? Has it become magnified? Has it become, you know, is it smaller now, or has the company gone into other dimensions altogether? That would be very, very important. The other one is maintenance of the networks. Yes, we've been a team of 30 that were selected as researchers. It would be very good to keep up this network, and because the whole purpose also, part of the purposes was to empower the researchers from ACP countries. So it would be good to hold on to the network and to keep doing what we're doing, because we've honed our skills and become even better. And then lastly, somebody else raised it in the chat, is the issue of gender. I'm a researcher in gender. And of course, coming on so strong with my gender research into this program was not very, very possible, but understandably so, because the companies that we are looking at, some of them have been in existence for 3 years, 2 years. So if I want to do a gender assessment on them, their primary goal coming into business was, we want to make money in order to function in the long run. So the primary concern would not necessarily be let's prioritize gender. It would be let's prioritize being a going concern and existing in the long run. So although somebody has raised it in the chat, how we can incorporate gender, I feel that it's something that we can keep talking about, keep discussing, and keep it at the center of our discussions. Not just gender, but also social inclusion, including other minority groups that may be falling through the development cracks as we help these companies go on. Thank you very much.
Esther, thank you very much. I really appreciate your comment. And you made a couple of extremely relevant remarks. I also find that an essential part of the program was to have our scientific committee behind, with all the expertise that was actually allowing, on the one side, the project to be perceived as credible on the outside, and also an academic point of view, but also to have this learning experience, both for us as an institution, for you as researchers. And also, I think everybody could appreciate the essential feature of this program, that is the enthusiasm of the researchers, people like you that really learn a lot, brought a lot to the program. So thank you very much for that. I would move to the last intervention, and Franco, the floor is yours. As I was saying, we were very keen to have you in the program because I think as a European institution, we are on the side of having our effort to be in the market, to provide financing and activities for development, for having an impact on development. But more and more, it's important to prove this development impact, prove that there is an impact on what we do. And we are trying from the EIB side on various ways, combining various instruments, but I was really keen to also show what we are doing with these impact assessment studies, and maybe you can give your perspective of what you think about this. Thank you very much, Franco.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you very much to the EIB and GDN for inviting the Commission to share a few thoughts about the outcome of what is a very important program, as you very eloquently explained. Impact measurement, in fact, is receiving much more attention compared to some years back. First of all, by managers of EU-funded intervention, which in a way should be normal, but is not so straightforward. You know, our colleagues are really trying to push difficult program and projects in difficult situations. So let's say to bring back the idea of impact is a challenge in itself. But a big push comes also from other part of the Commission, from our so-called control institutions, and as well from the European Parliament and the member states. As it is known, the EU is still the bigger provider of official development assistance, and therefore we have a very important responsibility to make sure that this money, which is public money, is taxpayer money, is bringing the result that we want to bring. So to us, the work that you just presented, or let's say pre-presented, is very clear. I would say the bigger picture. So that will be one question for the panel from our side. Let me conclude briefly, and coming back to what we were asking, to how this will mean for our approach, for what we do in INPA in terms of trying to measure impact. You know, in result collection, we did quite an investment in result reporting. We are able in 2020 to, let's say, try to get results for more than 3,000 projects. And I include not only finished project, completed project in administrative terms, but also ongoing project. This was a big increase compared with the previous years, where we were only limiting our analysis to completed projects. So we are able, let's say, to do that through a tool. Is a relatively simple tool, which is called the U-Result framework, where we try to fix what also Franny, interesting, was saying, some indicators that we can use to, let's say, communicate it in a much clearer way with the wider public. So, but despite that, let's say, the fact that we don't have a commonly, the fact that we have a common agreed result measurement, still with different level of indicators, reporting remain for us a challenge. And this, this is an important message that comes from your study. Cooperation is necessary. I think I'm very interested to use, let's say, GDN with the EIB and what Franny said, World Development Report with the IFCs as good example of a partnership. Now, as you know, our Director General changed the name recently. We used to be Development Cooperation, now we are International Partnership. I think this is one of the key words. We need, let's say, a much more renewed partnership to make sure that what you show so nicely with the report come, through a collaborative approach, something, a kind of, I would say, a better seen reality. Considering the challenge that we have still with the data collection, we cannot assume that with the complexity we are entering, particularly, with the program we are cooperating with the bank, the European Fund for Sustainable Development, which is crowding in investment in reality that are not really easy to measure. So this is a key finding and a key message from your study. So let me conclude by saying that it was extremely interesting for us to note that log frame is still in your work an indispensable feature of the methodology. Log frame from many colleagues, and I would say in general, is still considered a technical tool, if not even a bureaucratic one. We are trying really to go against this view, and particularly because even in within our DG, we're trying to move, and I would say within the Commission at large, we are trying to move from an approach where was really centered on compliance and accountability in a way to performance. And if we want to move credibly to that, the impact, measuring impact should become, you cannot do it without it. In that case, in that respect, I also have another quick question to the panel, because for some difficult way to measure, we normally use ex-ante impact measurement. But we're trying really to push the emphasis, and I think this was a point from Esther when she was saying, what can we measure more longer in time? Not just T, but T plus few years. And I know the EIB is doing evaluation after few years after the project have been completed, and we are looking with a lot of interest in this experience. So the point is, how can we find a better balance between ex-ante assessment and ex-post assessment? So I would say this is basically what I wanted to share with you. And let me just repeat that this work can really help us, first of all, again, as Pierre was saying at the beginning, to have more investment in the research in this aspect. We are very conscious of that, and we try. We are in our programming period now with the new financial period 2020, 2027, and we'll try really to get a bit more resources for investing in research and development activities. And let me finish with really with the hope that we'll be able to start some interesting work in a renewed partnership for these important topics. Thank you very much again, Deborah, for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. I think we heard a lot. I have and thank you very much, Franco. I really liked your comments, and particularly the last point. This is something that is very close to us. we love so much this program that we really would like to have opportunities for continuing this kind of operation going forward. It would be nice to find ways for working on this together. And I really think that we built something unique, starting with the partnership with GDN, with the scientific committee, with the researchers, the network of researchers that is there, the way of working with the private sector, and it's something that we really would love keeping and potentially also revisiting some of the work that we have done now in a few years' time in order to see ex post really what has been the impact. I have a very difficult challenge because we wanted to have a time for Q&A, but I think that our timing is kind of over the time of the discussions. I've seen a lot of questions. People were much better than me. I cannot do two things, moderating and answering questions, but I've seen that the very people in the program, Pierre, Manuel, and Nina, have been quite active in answering the questions. I just would at this stage ask, maybe, I don't think that there is any unanswered questions. So unless Pierre, you suggest something different, we could skip the Q&A session, or okay, I don't have any different indication. Okay, no, I have actually the suggestion that we can keep a few questions and we can go a little bit over time. So please just pass your questions in the chat, and I would be happy to read it, or just raise your question asking for it. Is there anything? Is there any question? If there is no specific question, I think at this moment I would really, I think we really had a lot of questions already in the Q&A session, so I would leave it there. I would just conclude saying that for us this program has been a fantastic experience, but really bringing a lot of results in terms of better understanding how to enhance the impact of our project, how to dialogue and create the link between the academic side of research, the researchers' interest in projects, and on the other side, in learning about the development impact of the projects. That's unique. We are really happy of so far, and looking forward for continuing this experience, this type of experience in some way. Before we close, I'd like to remind everybody that we have a second seminar of this series coming up on Friday. We are discussing some of the challenge that the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown at researchers working on development, and learn about some of the innovative and creative ways the research and data community have been responding. This is going to draw on the EIB-GDN experience, but not only. We have other impressive contributions coming out from researchers and professional working in Africa and elsewhere that is not only related to our program. So we are looking forward for a good discussion also in that seminars, and I hope I will see as many as you joining as possible. And with that, thank you very much to the seminar participants, also the the program participants are part of it, and a special thank also to Pierre and the GDM team for bringing all of us together today. Thank you very much.